Yes. Now, we turn back to the first part of the session, which is back again to Mr. Applebaum to answer the questions that were addressed to him, and then again moving on to the second part of the session with our colleague, Mr. Coelho, and the guest speaker, Mr. Campbell. Mr. Applebaum, the floor is yours.
Thanks again. It's a tough act to follow. That report on Echelon that Duncan Campbell was involved in, that he was involved in, is very influential for me in learning about cryptography, and also in considering that there was hope for resisting surveillance, or that actual legislators cared about the surveillance. Not every single person thought it was legitimate for it to be secret. So a couple of things I wanted to do. I guess there's a ridiculous number of questions to answer, and I'll try to sum up my answers as quickly and as succinctly as possible. One thing I wanted to encourage is that this topic is very dense. It requires what we had in the United States we call the Church Committee. We require a Church Committee in the United States again, basically, because we need subpoena power. We need the ability to actually ask people who are in a position of power, who are not in a political position, to answer specific questions. So as an example, I would really encourage any of you that would like to help myself or Duncan Campbell to get our dossiers from all of the relevant intelligence agencies in the world. If you'd like to see what the capabilities of these systems are, I assure you that between the two of us, we have some files that are worth reading. He has to consent, but I consent. Feel free to put it on the internet as well. So that said, you mentioned the purpose. I think that the purpose is exactly as stated. That is to say that the job of an intelligence agency is to assist with control. And slowing things down, as Alan said, is, I think, one of the fundamental ways that this can help politicians, but in general it can help many different groups to have a kind of control. So slowing down the publication so that you have more time to understand what's coming, so that you can shred documents, so that you can change program names, so that you can find out if anybody inside is planning to leak anything by giving them an extra polygraph and firing them or bringing them up on charges. I think fundamentally the purpose of surveillance systems is control. And that is exactly what we see these systems being used for, right? So surveillance is not an end towards totalitarianism. It is totalitarianism itself, limited in scope at the moment. But when the Golden Dawn in Greece has access to the interception systems with their racist ideology, what will happen? Well, it will be very different with and without a surveillance system. In the history of Europe, we've seen this with the IBM punch card systems. Right? Those punch card systems are the difference between millions of lives, actually, in France and in Holland. So I think the purpose is clear. It's control. Now, what that control will be used for the United States is very different than what it will be used for by the German services, for example, or by the British services. But we know, at least in the United States, that this surveillance data is used towards illegal wars. We know that it's used towards assassination of our own citizens without a trial. So in this sense, it's the ultimate kind of control, which includes the death penalty. So that's also a kind of censorship, if you will, in extreme form. And then to the German, Herr Voss, I think is his name. He wanted to know if it was used... Voss, yeah. He wanted to know some of the usage. And from what I can tell, there is definitely economic espionage. Economic espionage seems to be a key reason. And the U.S. actually argues that it stops economic espionage using this, which I think is fascinating. I'm not sure that that is true. I'm not exactly sure how to tell if that were true at all. I suppose the argument is essentially your democratic process works really great for you, but it doesn't work great for us. But trust us, we're helping you. It's definitely used for war. It's, in my experience, personal and professional, and with my colleagues, political persecution. It's very clear. And, what to do to find balance. I think a key thing to understand here is that we have a whole bunch of spies, which is to say generally criminals, who are saying that we need to use them as a vanguard for securing ourselves. And the way that we do that is that we leave ourselves intentionally insecure in hopes that they will protect us. But in Germany in particular, what we've seen the government say is that German citizens, German businesses, they're on their own to protect themselves. And this is, I think, not the right balance. If the network itself is insecure, if all networks by design are insecure, we have some serious problems. And that, I think, is not the right balance. I think, in fact, when someone tells us that they are securing us, we should be secure. That's actually a fundamental prerequisite of that being an honest thing. And, you know, to that end, Albrecht had mentioned this question about collaboration between agencies. And I think that there is a massive amount of collaboration between agencies, and I think that it's apparent in what has been said in public and from the documents that have been seen, as well as in conversations that people have had with Snowden, as well as with other journalists that are involved in writing about these things. And in the 20th century, we could say that intelligence services, generally speaking, were working for their states against the rest of the states. And there were obviously alignments. And these days, it seems to be the case that all the intelligence agencies are collaborating with each other against us, which is terrifying, to say the least. But 70%, I was speaking with Laura Poitras a couple of days ago, and she was suggesting to me that the number is something like 70% of the SIGINT take comes from collaboration with companies. So that means that we could secure 70% of our communications data if we incentivize, if we create protection in the way that we actually communicate with businesses and with each other, and to reduce that collaboration. Because it is not merely a question about whether or not the US government or a European government has access to this data, but what happens when the Chinese government compromises one of those companies. In the case of Google, they were able to compromise, as I understand it, the FISA wiretap system inside of Google. So the Chinese were able to find out who the foreign intelligence targets were in Google. So it's not about whether or not we trust Google. It's about whether or not we acknowledge that we don't get to make that choice. Someone else makes that choice, regardless of what the laws or policies say. And so towards what we can actually do, I think we need to actually secure ourselves. So I have in my pocket here a cryptographic telephone, which actually helpfully told me that there was some interception-like capabilities in this building. Just as a side note, might be a bug, but maybe it's a feature. This phone, short of breaking into it, when I make a phone call, no one here, and short of a mathematical breakthrough, is going to be able to intercept it. I have a couple different encrypted text messaging programs. I have the Tor projects, Tor Orbot program. I have CryptoPhone, Redphone, TextSecure, some other things. And so actually doing research into how to build decentralized, distributed, secure systems that are freely specified, openly specified, with no backdoors, with no ability to coerce the developers into adding backdoors, to actually embrace the idea of liberal democracy and to drive it home, that we have the right to speak freely, that is something which I think we really can do. And it's not like a pipe dream, we can do it someday. It exists right here. And you don't have it, probably. But why do I have it? Shouldn't you have this? I think the answer is yes, you should. And most of you don't, and most of you are, without question, targeted. So, but the point is not this specific device, because, you know, it's some prototype, but rather the point is that every single person in the world should have that when they pick up their phone normally. Why is that not the case? And the answer is this fundamental tension between people that are supposed to keep us secure, and the way they keep us secure is by actually keeping us insecure, literally and technically. In the case of GSM, there was a different version of GSM constructed for export so that intelligence services could spy on some of those nations that would deploy it. And the Washington Post published a cost estimate. It's something along the lines of, I think it was $52.6 billion a year. So since 9/11, more than $500 billion for the intelligence budgets, the black budget. I don't think that for example, encompasses all things that I might consider to be that. I don't think, for example, the CIA torture and rendition flights were in that budget. And I mean, there's like so many kind of like terrifying aspects to the way some of the questions were asked, just as a sort of meta point. So like, for example, do Five Eyes countries, that is to say UK, USA, New Zealand, Canada, and United Kingdom, do they help each other out as a matter of circumventing national laws? And the answer to that is very clear. It's yes. There's, in fact, even a place in Washington, D.C., where some British and some American intelligence services share a building where I've been told, I haven't been able to see it, I have some satellite photos of it, where it's a retransmission of information between the two parties. so that one party can intercept on one side and the other party can intercept on the other. This would be something that's worth looking into. I sort of hope Duncan will do that in his spare time. And then, yeah, has the NSA compromised European computers? I'll just say yes to that. That's like totally, completely without question the case. Now, I wouldn't think of it so much in terms of computers. I would ask yourself about atomic power plants, hospitals, parliamentarians, and I think the answer to those is also yes in specific. So I would be pretty upset. That's very serious because when these guys are messing around with control systems, for example, what happens when they accidentally do something to a control system and it fails? Who is responsible for that? Does that count as an act of war? Do they have any economic responsibility for it? So there's really serious consequences when we start to talk about that. And there's a lot of fear-mongering about so-called hacktivists or hackers, and not a lot of talking about how if the Chinese are so terrible, for example, for having compromised a bunch of people and gotten caught, what are the NSA for having compromised basically everyone and gotten away with it? I mean, if the Chinese are concerning, it seems to follow that the NSA's total compromise of these systems is actually more concerning. And there's a lot of psychological cost as well. I mean, I've been targeted by the U.S. government for the last 4 years for my involvement with WikiLeaks. So I've been targeted by 2703D orders. Those are administrative subpoenas, sealed search warrants, probably if I knew I wouldn't be allowed to tell you. Other legal processes that if they were to exist, I would not be able to tell you about their existence. An FBI agent once actually let me know that eventually I did become aware of a national security letter, thus accidentally leaking that there was one. And these kinds of legal instruments are terrifying, in particular because they use the language of terrorism about WikiLeaks, which is nonsense. WikiLeaks is not terrorism, it is effective journalism. And in the case of indiscriminate document dumping, as the French journalist had mentioned, it's important to note that it was actually The Guardian itself that made that mistake, and not WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks took great steps to be able to redact names. In fact, they were criticized heavily by the free information world for taking the steps of redacting informants' names in particular. And the State Department actually stopped using that talking point after they accidentally leaked my name to some people, which is just kind of a side note worth talking about later. But this kind of thing does not end with technology. It's not just that my computers or my cell phones have been compromised or that my accounts have been targeted legally, but my family members have been targeted. My partner woke up in the middle of the night with men with night vision goggles watching her sleep in her own home. These kinds of things are a part of press freedom in the United States now, and they use the language of terrorism. So when detaining me and seizing my property, they have literally called me a terrorist, denied me access to a lawyer, denied me access to a bathroom, and threatened literally my life in various different ways. And there's tons of legal action that's going on, but as a result of all that, I live in Germany now. Because it is better to be an immigrant in Berlin than it is to be a citizen in the United States. Right? And that should tell you about the situation. And you can look at Glenn, who lives in Rio right now, and Laura Poitras, who is my neighbor in Berlin as well. And you can see that people who are working on these types of issues as journalists, their actions speak for themselves, regardless of whether or not they are brave in public. None of us are really in a hurry to go back to the United States and end up like Chelsea Manning, or to end up like, let's say, James Risen. Right? This is fundamentally a huge problem because Obama does not actually stick to his statement about protecting journalists, and in fact, instead wiretaps them. The Department of Justice wiretaps them. And when Clapper lies under oath about NSA surveillance, we see exactly the same problem. Total impunity for people, in some cases, who are not even elected, and absolute ruthlessness for the people that are targeted by them as political enemies. And that's a very concerning aspect. And the only thing that I see that really seems to give me a lot of hope is that in Europe, there's a huge debate about these things. And there's a really, really fantastically free press, despite the fact that the First Amendment is very good. There are many American publications who literally run their articles by the CIA before they go to publish them as part of their not being persecuted or prosecuted strategy. That was, I believe, what Bill Keller did with the WikiLeaks cables and the New York Times. All due respect to the New York Times, none to Bill Keller. This is something that I think is totally offensive. And working with Der Spiegel, for example, you don't see that kind of collaboration. You see people who are in service of the truth, who do verify these documents, who are caring about what is actually happening. And this is something which just, I wouldn't do this from the United States again, at least not for a long time. So we should also address the myth that this is a post-9/11 issue. It is not. The NSA has been doing this kind of widespread collection, including on U.S. citizens, for a long time. There's a program called Shamrock, which I would really encourage you to look into. And also another program which was actually the FBI. It's called Cointelpro, or the Counterintelligence Programs. This is where they tried to blackmail Martin Luther King Jr. This is where they went after a number of people. And the types of harassment that we see now, like what my partner experienced with the night vision goggles, what I've experienced being detained at airports, or having black bag jobs where people break into my house but don't leave a note to even mention it, that kind of stuff is like Cointelpro, except it also happens electronically. And now, unlike in the 70s, the U.S. government asserts that it is completely legal. And in some cases, they might be correct, thanks to things like the Patriot Act. So, yeah, there's like far too much for me to actually answer every single other question, so I'll just be very brief here and say, you know, when Obama says that we don't need to be afraid, I think, first of all, it's insulting to every single one of you in the room. Because when he says to Americans, don't worry, we don't spy on Americans, I think, what about every other human being on this planet? That, to me, is something which is extremely, extremely upsetting. And I apologize on behalf of my incredibly insulting president for saying that about each and every one of you, because that is not acceptable in a civilized world. And he's also wrong, because my experience with WikiLeaks is that Americans have more to be afraid of. And the reason is because there is a system and a culture of repression that in some cases is so total, there are people that will not pick up the phone to talk for fear of the metadata alone linking them to my telephone. So in the United States, I basically don't have a telephone that people know about. I have one for an emergency and it's never powered on. So is it used for coercion? Is it used, and is data passed, for example, to autocratic regimes? Is it used to study groups? Is it used to disrupt? Yes, yes, and yes. Might they force or forge data? Absolutely. In fact, I've been detained at borders where they let me know how utterly in trouble I was going to be, but that they could not arrest me, which is a very fascinating thing. And I'm not allowed to see this file. I'm not allowed to correct this file. I'm not allowed to know it. They've accidentally let me see the file while holding me in an interrogation cell. Their two-way mirror wasn't quite so good. And in this case, I said, hey, that data is wrong. And they said, well, no, you can't see it. I said, but I already did. And they said, well, no, you didn't. Okay. So clearly, someone makes mistakes. And whether it's an intentional mistake is a good question. But how do we do this to detect this kind of surveillance? It's easy. Do you use a phone? Do you have a tracking device? Do you make a call? It was probably intercepted. The metadata is almost certainly logged. And in some cases, through outsourcing, the billing of your cell phone data is sent, in some cases, to Israeli billing companies where they are cut rate because the product is actually your social graph. They don't care at all about what they're actually doing billing-wise. So having some legislation where that kind of outsourcing isn't possible would be a really useful thing to do. And yeah, so finally, I think, you know, the WikiLeaks spy files version 3 was just released yesterday and is continuing to be released now. This shows the sort of techniques that corporations have and the marketplace, the multi-billion-dollar marketplace for surveillance equipment. And it shows the complicity with many of those executives. About 20 of them were investigated by the WikiLeaks counterintelligence unit. And the WikiLeaks counterintelligence unit found that many of them were traveling from Europe to repressive regimes to sell to repressive regimes surveillance software, so including targeting people that I personally know who are journalists in Morocco, targeting people in places like Ethiopia, targeting people in places like Egypt. So this is something that I think Europe can do a lot with by actually stopping these types of exports potentially, or at least ensuring that there's a right of private action for anyone who is affected by it, so that when Hacking Team or Finn Fisher or any of these people comes to such a country and then innocent people are harmed, that they have a chance of having justice here if it is not presented there. And finally, I want to say privacy versus security is one of these points I keep hearing people touch upon. And I think it's absolutely critical to do away with this this talking point, because it's, with all due respect, it's the wrong one. And the reason is because privacy is a function of actually having security. It is not the case that we will have privacy by having no privacy, right? It does not make sense. By having a total surveillance state, we can't say that our data is private when we have things like LoveInt. If you're not familiar with this, this is the NSA term for surveilling your love interests. It's so frequent that they call it, like SIGINT, signals intelligence, love intelligence, right? Unfortunately, it's not funny if you've ever had somebody do something like that to you. And so I would say that this is actually a question about dignity and agency and liberty. And these concepts rest on the concepts of confidentiality, integrity, and authenticity, but most of all, consent. And this is something which is not actually present in any of these systems. And so we are offered security, but we're actually given intentionally weakened systems that are exploited and used against us. And this creates a horrible chilling effect. And, well, maybe not horrible for Europe, because many investigative journalists from America are moving here. But in general, it's horrible for their families and their friends. And, yeah, and there's a lot to be done about it. And research and development in the European context to decentralize and to secure these systems, and to recognize that it's not the exception that we need this security, it should be the rule that we need this, that will really move us forward in a very positive way, and we can start to change these things and to right these wrongs. So thank you very much.
We thank you. We thank you, Jacob. We thank you. We thank you. Mr. Jacob Applebaum, you certainly made a most compelling case. We thank you for your courage and your boldness, and certainly, you've addressed us, showing openness to state your mind, and you will certainly help us out to state our mind in the work ahead. So we really thank you for being here and for this piece of strong advocacy for the values we are here to stand for. Thank you for that. And now we move on way behind, as I insisted, to part number 2.